So before we begin this lecture, I just want to address the deer horn that I've been wearing during the previous lectures and now this one. I am a member, an adopted member of the deer clan at Six Nations, the Cayuga Deer Clan. They're beautiful, gentle people. They're very close to the Creator, and they loved me, even though I'm a Mohawk, a warrior. They're not warriors. They don't kill. But they liked me. They said, "Do you understand us, Bill? Come and join our clan, and we'll give you a name. And you're going to be in the deer clan. And deer is going to be your totem." I said, "Wow, I had never thought about the deer." "Very special, Bill. Oh, they're very, look at the deer in the forest and you'll know how special they are. Big, but graceful, cautious, alert, here and there. And even when they're hunted, they are formidable beasts to hunt because they have wonderful qualities of camouflage. And the members of the deer clan said, "You should be like that. That is a safe way to be in the world, Bill." So I got this deer horn. I have several deer horns. One very small one that I'm supposed to wear when I die. It was brought to life in a tobacco burning ceremony by my chief. So it's a very sacred thing to me. I don't have it on today. But you'll notice, and we use ribbons as symbols. You noticed on my ribbon shirts. Well, look at this. There are two ribbons here. Guess what? One is red for the red race. One is blue for the blue bloods, the British native. Yet they come together very harmonious. And that happens to be me. Now, this picks up the movie that we watched the excerpt from in the last lecture, The New World. And what we didn't see was the end of the movie, where you have that lovely woman, native woman, who's never named in the movie, but is presumed to be Pocahontas of mythical identity, and her husband, John Smith, who is the very noble Englishman, played by Christian Bale, who wants her to come back to England with him. And she does. And the English women show her how to dress, show her the ways of the British, very much like they showed our hero Joseph Brant how to live. And in a sense, she was assimilated. But she became pregnant, and she had a child. Now, who is that child? The movie ends with that. Very much like myself, I have to say. My mother is Mohawk, my dad is British. So who is the result of that? It is the New World. And this is the New World. But this is the New World teaching you about the Old World because it's my duty, because I know it so well. And I want you to understand the beautiful sanctity and history of this land. Not of another land somewhere else. Not of another disconnected architectural conversation about buildings that have no real context, but have great interest as architectural artifacts. Is that architecture? I would like to say no, it's not. But it's practiced by the colonizer. He objectifies everything, including the building. And as a matter of fact, when we're sitting in rooms like this, it is a colonial building on a certain level, because all around us are manufactured materials that only non-native people would ever conceive of as a proper thing to put on a floor or a wall, drywall. But beyond that, we have brick. Brick comes directly from the ground. Clay. And then we have some wood. That's direct too. So in a sense, we're in this kind of in-between world in architecture. But we see it as one thing. We are the architects and we're in charge of everything, every material. So if it's steel or if it's wood, we don't care. We'll do something with it. But there's a huge difference between something which is heated and beaten and tortured into shape or something which is benevolently taken from the forest. The quantum difference. Huge. And if you walk around in a steel building, I would challenge you to tell me that you are feeling soul. That goes for one of my great architectural heroes, Mies van der Rohe. He's German. He loves steel. He said that steel is our epoch. He would say this, a very quiet man, but he'd say a few succinct things, and that was one of them. We are in the epoch of steel and glass. And in a sense for him it was, but not for us. But what he did with steel and glass is absolutely sublime. And the way he used stone is right from nature. His parents, or his dad and brothers, were quarrymen, stonemasons. That's how he learned to be an architect, through stone. So you'll see that Mies clads his lobbies in travertine marble, always, but with the grain running across rather than up and down. He does not believe in using the travertine standing up. He said, we'll do it like we take it right from the quarry, and up those beautiful walls in his lobbies. And the use of wood. Mies, as steel and glass as he was, he used wood to the most sublime ends in wood paneling in his buildings. So, but I'm divesting because I'm just trying to help you to understand the nature of this course is existing between worlds and bringing them together and letting the first culture of this land be the host and show you our ways. Because as the Romans used to say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, we could say that too. When in native land, do as we do. As a matter of fact, our ceremonies always teach visitors and settlers to practice our ways. Why not? There are ways, our ways are good ways, and they're the ways of this land. But you cannot have that conversation today. It would seem ridiculous when what we have done is anneal native people within an inch of their own dignity through politics, war, disease, residential schools, and violence. The violence of authorities, beating and maiming native people, and then never being held responsible for it because they're only Indians. Only, I'm saying only, very big, only. Now, this lecture I'm diverting because it's a very difficult lecture. Extremely difficult to look at. I've used kind language in the title. The architecture of dispersal and reconfiguration means after you've been, then you come back together into something new, which is actually something old, but reconstituted. And that's exactly what we did. Iroquois under assimilation, okay? Now I'm going to show you how we got assimilated and then destroyed. We almost got destroyed, but we didn't. And so I'm going to show you why we didn't get destroyed. You see in the middle is the piece tomahawk, the pipe and the tomahawk. This particular one has feathers of the eagle on it. This is a very, very sacred tool, which was used in ceremonies time and time again for hundreds of years. And now we look at it, oh, isn't that cute, a nice Indian tomahawk. I like it for my collection, because that's what it's come down to. We're going to talk about in the lecture after this one how Iroquoian artifacts have been collected and where they've been collected, just so you can see how the colonizer destroys a culture by turning it into a cultural artifact rather than a living thing. This is Joseph Brant, another portrait of him. This was done in England for Percy, Lord Percy. He commissioned it. And this is when Brant was visiting him. And this is probably the most accurate portrait of what Brant looked like. He has soft Iroquoian features. And our headdresses always were surmounted by feathers. He is a Mohawk, but he hasn't worn the Mohawk headdress. He's worn something they put together in England for this portrait with feathers. And you'll see around the headband there is a silver covenant chain. And our headbands on the really fine Gastoas, and I'll bring mine in maybe in 2 lectures, and show you the beautiful headband on mine. A friend of mine had it custom made to match one in the McCord Museum in Montreal. It's about 400 years old. And when I wear it with pride, because very few of our Gastoas have the true silver headbands. And I happen to have one on my own Gastoa. Then he wears the breastplate given to him by George III, and there are more silver chains around his shoulder. And he's a fierce fighter, but look at how compassionate his eyes are. There's actually love in that portrait. Love. In the beautiful background, Stuart was the painter. He was a great English portraitist, did all the great, big families in England, and then he did a few like this one of Joseph Brant. And then here, now just so I trigger you, what happened at the last lecture, a beautiful Georgian house in the woods, surrounded by a circle of white pines. You'll notice this artist captures the circle of white pines, and in the circle of white pines sits the circle of the 50 chiefs in council. Outside the bedroom window of William Johnson. Now William, he was bedridden because of his disease, as I expressed, and so he used to watch the council from his bedroom window, which is the window to the left of the rear door. This is an amazing consolidation of 2 cultures in absolute perfect harmony. Harmony. Keep that word in mind. Harmonious. We are harmonious. When William Johnson died, there was a great tragedy for the chiefs. And they took his body on a bier, because we have what we call sky burial. We lift the body up into the trees and let the birds do their thing. But we put him on a bier and took him into the woods and performed a high condolence over his body and gave him the most honored death that a Mohawk man could have had. And he was happy with that, apparently. I'm sure he was, because he spoke our language, he knew our customs. His beautiful wife, because Molly was very beautiful, had all the children, and he said, "This is the life that I dreamed of back in Ireland, and I'm proud of it." Boom. And of course, the stair railing, because at that council, the chiefs, when the American Revolution was growing, they decided they were going to remain neutral. And Brant said, "That's impossible. We can't remain neutral. The 2 sides are strong. So we have to join one or the other, because we don't have as many people as they have." The British, brought over thousands of soldiers on ships. And the Americans, of course, are already immigrants with, a lot of fighting ability, so to speak. So Brant, after he was basically voted down, he went up the stair with his tomahawk and chipped these marks into it in frustration and anger, and then promptly went up to his bed and tried to sleep it off. But he didn't stop there. Why didn't he stop there? Well, because of what happened next. This is a map from the journals of Clinton and Sullivan. And you see in the middle is Seneca Lake, and next to it is Cayuga Lake. And in red, you will see the paths that these men took through our territories. One up the side of Cayuga, one up the side of Seneca, and then right at the bottom, they're up in the hills, and then they go up and they go across to the trail which leads to Niagara. And what are they doing? Well, it's 1784, the American Revolution has come to a close, and there are fighting generals who have nothing to do now. So George Washington, what we call the village burner, sent these two men, actually there were three men, up into Iroquois to genocide us. And the fools kept a detailed diary of how they genocided. It would be a little bit like Hitler's SS having a journal and describing everything they did to the people. Well, these two men did just that. And those journals still exist. They're down in New York State, and they have been republished. But let me tell you that the academics down there are so uncomfortable with these journals. They're so truthful, and they're so ugly, and they are so accusatory. I mean, if you want to talk about a genocide, there is no argument. Of course it was. Here's coming from the men who are perpetrating the genocide, their delight in everything they are doing. Killing women and children and burning crops. And, our warriors are out and around trying to protect things, but they're outnumbered. And we fell. We fell. So Brant, in his wisdom, said, listen, the horned snake, we have to move. We have to leave our home of 1,000 years. Wow. This would be like asking the Palestinians to move out of Israel so the Israelis could come in. Well, what happens to their ancestral home? Why are they frustrated today? Well, that's us. I gave this lecture in public in Toronto, and there were some people, Palestinian people in the audience, who recognized this story, the same story that's happening to them in the Middle East, if you can believe it. I was a bit shocked because I had never put it together until they talked of it in a question and answer period after the lecture. It was genocide. So Brant, in his wisdom, this is Niagara Falls, and this is Fort Niagara, if you've ever been there. This fort is on the New York side. It was French for many years, then it was British, and then it became American. It was built by the French in the French Renaissance style. It's a beautiful and sturdy building right at the promontory where the Niagara River meets Lake Ontario. It's amazing. And across the other side, you'll see there's a forest and a ridge. That's called Queenston Heights. It's a very important location for Iroquois people. And of course, down the river, you have the magnificent Niagara Falls. What a landscape to live out your genocide and your retreat as refugees in this epic, epic place that keeps people very high-minded as they go along in their desperate retreat from Iroquois. They were put up here in the winter of 1784, and there was no food. It was a British fort, and They hadn't stockpiled any food. So the people had to go through a winter with almost nothing to eat. It'd be a bit like being in a concentration camp where you had to eke out, the most desperately simple meals just to survive. And for us, it was like a concentration camp, because 1,500 of us are living in that cold stone building with no food. When springtime came, Joseph Brant had gone over to England to presumably meet with George III to try to secure some land in Upper Canada. And his dear friend, Hugh Percy, whom I showed you at the last lecture, was home again, the Duke of Northumberland. He met Brant in London and got him a hearing from George III. Now, it's very hard to see the king unless you have friends to introduce you. Hugh Percy was an ideal friend. However, George III was reeling under the Napoleonic Wars and other conflicts, and aside from the fact he was a very nice family man, he also had syphilis. And his mind was a bit deranged. It's a very famous story of George. He had many kids. He loved children. But he was sick. But Hugh Percy was able to convince him, let's give the Six Nations some land in Upper Canada. What is that land going to be? Well, here you see a picture of George's representative in Canada. He lives in Montreal, Quebec, because there is nothing in southern Ontario at this time. Only Native people had occupied it. 1785. There are no settlers here. Zero. Whether you can imagine it. This is a place of great forests, and there are no settlers. There are only Native people. Wow. Well, Haldimand was instructed to try to make arrangements for a piece of land for the Six Nations. And he chose the Grand River. Really sight unseen. He used maps. He liked the location of the Grand River because it kind of separated the realm of the British from the realm of the French, who were focused on Detroit. And of course, the English were now up in Montreal. They'd taken it over. So you had the two sides. You had the Niagara Escarpment, and then you had the Grand River. These are very, very important to people at that time, because the only real map in their minds were natural features, a river, an escarpment. And here we are. So the agreement was called forth in a very important looking document called the Haldimand Tract. And they, surprising enough, can't find it today. But we have records of it. And what it said basically was, we will give the Mohawks, he said the Mohawks specifically, 6 miles or 10 kilometers either side of the Grand River from its mouth, which is present-day Dunnville, to its headwaters, which go way up into Muskoka. We took that quite literally. And so we moved out of Fort Niagara that spring, because we were anxious to get to some land that we could call our own so we could start growing food. We are agriculturalists, and we're hungry. I mean, it's so simple. And there on this map you see in light green the 6-mile tract. And it's been consolidated in surveys which kind of take the kinks out of the Grand River and give it this nice boot-shaped placement. But then you'll see in darker green, that is the size of our territory today. greatly reduced. What happened to all the other territory? Well, I mentioned last week, through the grace and intelligence of Joseph Brant, we sold it to settlers because they had no land. And the settlers were coming up from New England and other places in what's now the United States, desperate refugees, with nowhere to farm, nowhere to build a house. So we sold it to them. The interesting thing is that Europeans didn't feel they really had to pay Indians for land because the currency is in their currency and we're using it to charge them to buy land. Okay, well, we'll agree, but do you know that even to this day, those land agreements are not honored? There are many people here who are living on land which was purchased from Native people and never paid for. So what happens to it in the land registry? Well, if you're a colonizer, you just dismiss it as they're just a bunch of dumb Indians, which they tried to do. But Brant, in his intelligence, deposited the money, because there were no banks in Canada at the time. He deposited it in the Bank of England in London. Very smart, because that was a very great, well-established bank. And we have an account there even today. But the account, which was huge, it was thought to be the largest single accumulation of wealth in Upper Canada at that time. And it was done by a native person, Joseph Brant. That's amazing. It's amazing. Intelligence beyond intelligent in the way of the colonizer to the benefit of his native relations. Beautiful, beautiful working together. Now, over time, because settlers had so little, many did have great respect for Native people, I have to say. There are stories of beautiful friendships here in Southern Ontario which aren't told often enough. But a lot of people, like they are today, they're just absolutely profoundly racist. And they're unrepentant about it because they feel they have a right to, because they have white privilege, which they got from Europe. So it's caused conflict right down to today. And I tell you this story because this is the real source of the conflicts you see being played out every day, including just a few weeks ago. We do not forget what happened. But the people in nearby towns like Caledonia and Cambridge and whatever, Kitchener, Waterloo, they're all on our original land grant. They conveniently forget history when it gets in the way of their ideas of development, which they think is justified by anything. Let's just build something. And if you build something, then it's ours. This is what the Israelis do over in Palestine. They build villages and developments on Palestinian land and then say it's ours. It's a pretty ugly scenario, but it's not dead. And there is the Grand River. This has been designated one of the great rivers of Canada. I think there are about 7 or 8 of them. This is one of the most important rivers in the entire country. And there it is. Pretty well as you see it today. It's quite a wide river, and the edges of it are surrounded, except in the towns, like this one, by forests. And this river down here, just outside our window, used to look like this, forest coming down to the edge. And this is a very early map of the Grand River and the location of the 6 nations of Indians. You can just read it. This is from 1828, which is literally 30 years after we got here. It's not very, very long. And all up and down the river, you will see there are designations of what's there. The circles the important places. You'll see to the right, the lower right, the first circle, it's the village of the Lower Cayugas. Then we move up to Middleport, which is still there, and that is the realm of the Onondagas. Then we move up a little further, and it's the realm of the Senecas. What we're doing is kind of replicating the way we lived along the rivers of New York State, because that's all we knew. You go up a little further, and there is the Tuscarora village. And then you follow the Grand River into what is now Brantford, and come to this bend in the river, which is the original Mohawk village, which we're going to look at now. This is where we first came. It was the principal village of the Six Nations for a number of years. And what did we do when we got there? Here is, we don't know what the village looked like, of course, but this is a painting, shockingly done, by the wife of Governor Simcoe, who was brought over from England to found Toronto and to settle southern Ontario. But Mrs. Simcoe, because her husband was very self-important and very busy, had nothing to do. So she wrote a diary and she did paintings. So she came out to Six Nations because she had many friends who were Mohawk. She loved the Mohawk women. Her husband was a virulent racist. They lived together. And they had to sort this difference. Simcoe was only here a couple of years. But Mrs. Simcoe was very busy, and this is how she saw the village. To the right is the Mohawk Chapel, still there. To the left is the council house, and then in the middle you'll see there's a fairly large house. That is the house of Joseph Brant. This site is still there. It's still considered land of the Six Nations. And they built this building. It is the Mohawk Chapel. Now, when it was built, it's a very early sketch of it. It was a Georgian building. It had windows with curved heads. It had a door facing east. And of course the traditional Anglican, because it's an Anglican church, it's not Catholic, has the traditional Anglican steeple with the spires representing the four apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's in the wilderness. And it's one of the first buildings we built here when we came up. Where did we learn to do this? Well, we learned it from our friends down in New York State. This is how they built. We were fine doing, this is basically a log building, and you can go and see the logs because they have a section of the wall cut out so you can see the construction. Basically a log building with siding on it and cedar shake roof. And it's surrounded by a burial ground. Just like Anglican churches, and I can go there and see some of my relatives in that burial ground. The stones are all higgly-piggly like this because the freezing and thawing cycles make them seem like they're dancing. They get straightened out every once in a while. And there is the chapel today in all of its serene simplicity. Absolutely serene, with a lovely Georgian door, a spire, a very tall spire. The spire for us is a replication of the white pine in the forest. And I show the white pine off to the left because this, when we looked at the spire, we saw a white pine, not a spire. And the fact is, the spire comes from Northern Europe and was inspired in Germany by the pine trees there. So we go pine tree, spire, and we're replicating it here. Is that primitive? Are we imitating European culture, or are we actually giving a foretaste of European culture? Because we probably had this kind of understanding of the white pine long before they did down there, or over there in Germany. And there's our connection to Germany. So we have Germany, we have France, we have England, we have the Netherlands. These are our principal allies. This is the interior of the original Georgian church. It's all white with brown Georgian windows. And at the front, this is an Anglican tradition. We have the Ten Commandments on plates. And these Ten Commandments, and they're still there today, are all in Mohawk. And then the Beatitudes, which are the other principal things for the Anglicans. And this is the church the people visited out in the forest. It was the only church for miles around. And as a matter of fact, is the first Christian church in Ontario. Absolute first one. There are the Ten Commandments in Mohawk. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And the second like unto it, that you will treat your neighbor as yourself. And over the door is the coat of arms of the British Crown. These were given to the chapel by George VII. And they were carved in England and brought here and mounted over the door in the interior, designating it a royal chapel. Crazy, yeah? I say crazy because here are a bunch of Indians with very influential European friends and a very rich history. It goes way back before the U.S. and even Upper Canada. Now, when Brant came here, he did not want to live on the original Six Nations territory because he was thinking about his friend William Johnson, who built a big Georgian house in the forest. So Brant, interestingly, was he was a captain in the British Army. Very unusual, the only native one, I think, ever. And as a captain, you get a pension, and you get land. So he received his pension, a piece of land in what is now Burlington, Ontario. And if you're to go there, there's a place called the Joseph Brant Hospital, and next to it is a replication of what his house looked like. It was a Georgian house, just like William Johnson's, but in Upper Canada, in Burlington, Ontario, not far from here. This is an astoundingly rich history right at our doorstep, and one that almost no non-native person knows, which is a great tragedy because even in Burlington, the people in Burlington don't understand who Brant is, even though they have this replication of his house. They are supreme colonizers, and the town is filled with entitled white people with a lot of money, just like Oakville. And really, it's an unfriendly place for Native people in a certain way. You see at the bottom of this sketch, you have two Native people from Six Nations looking, across the bay, saying, "Oh, this is what Brant built. What are we living in? Would we like to live like that?" Yeah. And this is another beautiful story. This is the building in a recent photograph, although there's another story around the house. The house was built from descriptions in 1935, rebuilt as an important landmark along the Queen Elizabeth Way. Now, what you don't know around here is the man who was responsible for the design of the Queen Elizabeth Way, and a great friend of the great Canadian architect John Lyle, who's one of our finest architects ever, from Hamilton, Ontario. Mr. McQuestion loved Canada, and because he was the head of tourism and development, he was able to initiate these projects, which were visionary. I want to build Joseph Brandt's house there in Burlington, and at the other end, I want the fort at Fort Erie restored. And everything in between, that goes to Niagara Falls and back up, has to be stunningly beautiful. We must have sculpture all along that highway, and we will name it after Elizabeth. This was a simple man. He was a lawyer. He never married. He had 3 sisters. They never married. And they lived in a beautiful Georgian house in downtown Hamilton, which is still there. And it's a National Historic Site. Has very few visitors. Very important man, Mr. McQuestion. He was responsible for this. Recently, the town of Burlington said, well, we need to build a bigger museum near the house. And so they hired what is obviously, if I could say so, a very self-confident, non-native architect who not only did he move this house, he put it up on a hill. He took the entrance off of it and put in 2 Doric columns rather than the 4 we see here. Took away the stairway because he wanted to have nice wide steps going into the house. This is the architect. And then underneath it, put the museum. Destroyed the basement, put in a huge museum that goes off in this photograph to the left, and it goes off in a great curve, swoopy, kind of Frank Gehry kind of thing, but of course nothing like Gehry, really. But it was an imitation of the Gehry vocabulary, and it looks absolutely ridiculous. This building is popped up 30 feet out of the ground from here, sitting up on a pedestal that makes it look like a little child's playhouse. Disgraceful. I mean, to me. I know people on the committee, and I've even expressed my shock at this, but they, oh, well, Bill's just another Indian. We don't have to follow him. This is our town. That's where they are in Burlington. And to me, this is very, very dear to me in a way that it's not dear to any people there. And, you know, now it's just a memory. But that's okay. Everything fades into a memory. But I love the fact this is there, and I can drive into Burlington and see the link to our history. I'm one of the only people for whom it means anything. You'll see that over the entrance door is a Palladian window, which is what William Johnson had over his rear door in his house. This house has a central hall with 4 rooms, and the central hall has a stair in it. But the back door is the door into the kitchen, and I don't know whether that was part of Brandt's house or whether it was Mr. McQuestion's restoration. I don't know. But at any rate, there it is in its Georgian splendor with white siding. Remember the meaning of white. Now, this is a man who was with Joseph Brandt when he died. His name is John Norton. And you can see he has the pipe tomahawk. And Brandt gave him the duty to be the war chief of the Six Nations. Brandt died in 1804. This portrait was done in England and commissioned by Hugh Percy, the great friend of Joseph Brandt. And in the Duke's Regalia Room at Sign House in London, each of these portraits hangs over a door. One is the entrance, one is the exit. And that's where the Duke keeps his papers. Now, this man is quite interesting because he's Scottish and probably Mohawk. We don't know. He probably could be Cherokee. We don't know. He was the New World. He was the combined Scottish and Native. And he he was highly respected by our people for his leadership in warfare. And what war was he going to face? The next great chapter in our history, the War of 1812, which is an extremely important war for Canadians. We just got through celebrating it on a very high level. And John Norton was one of the heroes of the celebration. However, he's a mysterious figure because he wrote a diary of his time in the War of 1812, which became a very famous account. And it's still there. He wrote it, part of it in Mohawk. He translated the book of Matthew into Mohawk. And he is the principal witness to the War of 1812, native or non-native, anywhere. It's quite a diary. You could read it today. They republished it to honor the war. And the original of that document is in the library of Hugh Percy in Alnwick, the Alnwick Castle House. They keep the writings of this man in their library. They have the originals. So people go there to research. Just to review a little bit about the War of 1812. It was the last war we fought in native clothes, which meant we were shirtless and we wore a tunic and chaps and moccasins and our headdress. And we scalped in that war. We scalped settlers. So it was pretty frightening when the Mohawks arrived. We fought next to the Scots who came and the British, and then the renegades from across the lake, what are they're called Americans now. They fought in our way in the guerrilla style. We had taught them down in New York how to fight that way. The British, of course, fought in ranks. So they would line up in their redcoats in long rows, like in a shooting gallery. And anybody with a weapon could just come out of the woods and just... Now, I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most incredible, magical battles ever fought. And it took place here in Ontario at Stony Creek. You've heard of Stony Creek, perhaps, maybe not. It's a lovely small town outside of Hamilton. And they have a battleground there, which replicates this battle at Stony Creek. And it's a battle that the Six Nations participated in. The British came. They were all lined up in rows in their redcoats in a beautiful open lawn. And beyond that was a forest. And the forest was on Lake Ontario. The Americans, coming from Buffalo across the water, went over to the forest and hid in it, and were waiting for the battle to begin. The Six Nations sent out, we didn't have that many people, we sent out a lot of elders, and they stood at the top of the ridge about 100 meters apart and carried torches. The battle took place in the middle of the night, about 1 o'clock in the morning. We invited our warriors to come to stand behind the elders, because they were going to come from between the elders and go down and assist the British. Those warriors let out the war cry, which was so frightening to the Americans, because they'd heard it down in New York. Wah, 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 and it would echo through the forest. What happened at that battle? Those Americans retreated, scared to death. They said there were spooks in the woods. And they were so scared, they literally ran and surrendered. It We didn't even have to fight them. The Six Nations elders said that was our doing, because little do people know we were in the longhouse praying for the spirits of that forest to help us. And lo and behold, they did. And lo and behold, that battle was won. And it's a seminal battle in the War of 1812. The Americans next came to Toronto. They took Toronto twice, which should be a disgrace to that city. They were taken over by the British twice, not once, but twice. Partly because they were so self-confident, their British soldiers were all out drinking, having a good time when the Americans invaded. And the Americans really did a number on Toronto. They burnt the Parliament building down. They went up to Castle Frank and stole the original documents that created Toronto. And they took the royal mace from the House of Parliament and took it back as a trophy. And you know what? The Americans still have it. And it's a trophy at West Point. They have our mace there. And they're not going to give it back because we've asked them to give it back, because they lost the war, but they will not admit that they lost anything. And that's their hubris. We laugh at it. But we have to deal with it because we are in the bridging place between the United States, between Canada, between native and non-native, settler, European settler, and the great Iroquois. We are in this beautiful Netherland. And I call it Netherland. Think about it. Netherland is, well, we have the Netherlands in Europe. I mean, it's the Netherland. They're in between the sea and the land. The Netherland. It's an in-between place. And what's in the in-between place is called the common ground. Remember that phrase, common ground. It's extremely important to the conversation around decolonization. Fortunately, we have this photograph. These are 3 of our war veterans from 1812, photographed in about 1880. They were just little boys at the time. And here they've survived into old age, and they're war vets. And we took their picture, and this picture means so much to us. But notice what's draped across the back. The British ensign. The British ensign. Canada was only about 40 years old at that time. We didn't even think Canada was a country, really, because they never asked us, the Iroquois, to join their confederation. They never asked us. So we never did. And so we said, listen, you didn't invite us to join you, so we're not with you. And that's the way we are today. Sorry to be so emotional, because it's so ridiculous. The Canadian government still hasn't invited us to join the Canadian Confederation. Other Native nations somehow by default have, but we haven't. And that's why we fly the British ensign, to declare our allegiance first to Great Britain of all. And when World War I came, we went immediately to save our mother country, Great Britain. Same with Second World War. We went to those wars long before the Americans, because the Americans had an ambiguity about what England was, but we never did. We understood how they saved us. And they did. And there's another image of our land grant. It's been drawn numerous times. And then the great wampum of the Confederacy. And then this amazing picture of our chiefs about the same time with all of our wampum belts, doing a reading and interpretation of them. And that's how they looked. They had European clothes. They had European hairstyles. They dressed very tastefully. This was taken in a photography studio in Brantford, Ontario. It's a very famous photograph. I'm so glad it was taken. And then, at Six Nations, This is our old council house where those men we just saw used to meet. They were traditional chiefs. This is another very important story. They had the old titles that Taganawita gave us. And they were meeting in this building. This building had a spire on it. It was a very British town hall. And it was the center of marvelous celebrations when we had visitors from England. We had quite a few. Most of the British royal family, including the children of Queen Victoria, loved visiting Six Nations. And they loved being made honorary chiefs, which we always did. There's what it looked like. It's what it looks like today. It's closed today. So I'm going to tell you the story of that closing. But I want to just share a few things with you. This is how our people lived when the Longhouse was gone. These are vintage photographs, log cabins. And you know, we love log cabins. Principally because, and this is the ultimate tiny house. But it's not really that tiny, but it's extremely efficient. The main floor is quite large, and it's one room. Kitchen, living room, dining room, all that. Then a ladder goes up to the attic, and that's where everyone sleeps together in one room. That's like the Longhouse, when we had shelves for people to live on. But here they're living here, but in a greatly reduced expression of the Longhouse. But believe me, it is an expression of the Longhouse because of simple things like a center door and symmetrical windows on either side of the door. You could see the residue of Georgian architecture in this little cabin. And it's really not that little. I lived in one of those log cabins for 1 year when I was writing my dissertation. It was sort of an exercise, but I knew an elder who had one of the old houses for rent. So I rented it just to see what it was like. Of course, I wasn't there with a family. I was there alone. Now, here we see just a hint at the culture that was taking place while we were colonized. To the left, we have the famous Hadui masks of the Hadui Medicine Society, a secret healing society. The mask, to the left, you see a man carving one of them. These masks are so famous, and they sell for astronomical amounts of money, and they inhabit most major museums in North America. But you never see them. Why not? Because it's considered taboo to bring them out and display them. And the museums have honored that over time. My own chief was a master carver of the Hadui masks, and I used to sit with him in his carving shop while he carved these. And he would tell me, you know, why he was doing this design or that design, but he was a member of that society. And it's a secret society. We have them at Six Nations. Nobody knows who's a member of it, except those who are in it. And what do? Okay, well, they're healers. So they put on the masks when a healing is required, and they go to the house after dusk, and their symbol is the turtle rattle. It's made from a turtle. They put peach pits in it and a handle, and it becomes a rattle. They would take those rattles and go up to the windows of the house and just start making noise on the glass. Shh, shh, shh. And the patient who is inside, presumably in bed, is scared to death. Then the door is flung open, and these crazy people in these masks come in, and they start dancing around the room. And what do they have with them? Black ashes. They brought them from the stove. And they start throwing those ashes on the patient. Naturally, it's quite kind of dirty and messy. And they're covered with ash, and their sheets and the bed, It's a mess. Then they sing their sacred songs, and they leave. And presumably the healing should have been accomplished. And I have had friends who did have the Andui healings, and they were healed according to them. Just as somebody might be healed by a prayer of some sort, or some kind of religious healing or non-religious healing. There is no medicine involved except for allaying fear. You're supposed to go through your fear of your illness, and these men represent the fear and represent the letting go of the fear by leaving you in the house by yourself. We have other societies like the Corn Husk who do similar things, but the Corn Husk people, they wear masks of corn husk. I don't think I've shown pictures of them, but they heal by humor. They're the Light Society, and they wear white. And what they do, they come in and they do crazy things around you and make you laugh. That's supposed to be the healing method, laughter. This one is the allaying of fear. Native medicine. But it's all a part of the life. It's done in one of these log cabins, you see. Then here we see on the left, these pictures were taken without attribution of who these people were. They were taken by a man named Frank Speck. He came and photographed us at Six Nations. She's doing the corn husk weaving, just as we do today. And then to the right is a very famous chief, Seth Newhouse, with his wife and daughter outside of their home. He's very famous. Seth Newhouse wrote down the Great Law in its first written form ever. We don't agree with it entirely, but it was a very daring thing he did. More people from Six Nations. The portrait on the left is very famous. I find this man so strikingly handsome, but we don't know his name. It wasn't recorded. And then here we have more log houses. Six Nations was littered with log houses. A lot of people in the counterculture in the 60s, they would come to Six Nations because it was the kind of life they dreamed of having in their communal dreams. And here we were living it every day for hundreds of years. Now, I'm going to show you what are called the longhouses today. We were friends of the Quakers down in New York State. They liked us so much. And they noticed that our practice of sitting in these simple white rooms with benches was very much like their churches. And so they felt a kinship to us and said they would help us in any way they could. And the one way they could is they taught us writing, and they taught us how to write down our teachings, called the Code. The teachings were given to us, I referred to it at the last lecture, by a man called Scanadario. He's the handsome man who with a good message. This happened around 1705 down in Seneca country. He was an inveterate alcoholic and in a kind of stupor. He fell, what presumably dead, in the middle of the village, went unconscious. But when he woke up, he wasn't drunk anymore. And he said, it came to me in a dream, the message I'm supposed to bring you. And it's called the Message of Handsome Lake. And we still practice it today. It's the message for you how to live now that the settlers are here. And it's a codification of rules. The first one is no black book. No stringed instruments. Things like that. No love medicine. They think, where's love medicine? What's that? the people use it. We have herbs that are like drugs that people give now to people in the nightclubs and make them go into a stupor, and they fall in love with them, even though they don't want to. We call that love medicine, and it's still somewhat prevalent as Six Nations. People taking over a partner, usually a man taking over a woman against her will. But that was one of the things, no love medicine. And then we had to practice good mind. And so the code goes through, a number of things that are instructions to us, a little bit like the Beatitudes of Jesus. These are the rules now, and you can adopt them, and people did adopt them. And today, they practice it in the Longhouse. They're called the coders. They follow the code. The coders. I found it kind of strange at first. Coders, what are they? Code? Yeah, it's the Code of Handsome, like they call it. My chief was a preacher of the Code of Handsome Lake. Very moral man. So not only did he do the Hindui Mass, but he preached the code. And the coders are very, very strict. I'll tell you how strict they are, is that you have to go in front of the entire Longhouse once a year and confess all the things you did that are against the code. In front of the entire community. It's like Catholic confession, but instantaneously in front of everybody at the same time. It is scary. And they say if you have the nerve to go before the Longhouse and confess, you are a good person, the finest person. We absolve you of all of your mistakes. This is what the Longhouse looks like today. Basically a white box with simple windows in it and a door at either end, one for the women, one for the men. They're not all the same. This is a picture of two of the really old ones. And of course, we have the great circle wampum. And then this picture of the traditional chiefs meeting together in that council house I showed you earlier. This is what it looked like. It was like a Victorian town council meeting, except these people all have traditional old titles. They kind of sit in a circle. You'll see above their heads where they're sitting at the front, you have the principal chiefs. You see a portrait of Queen Victoria. It just seems like such a crazy contradiction, but it's called living together harmoniously. And there is the oldest Longhouse at Six Nations, 1785, the oldest building in Ontario. And I went to most of my ceremonies in this house, but everyone got together a few years ago and tore it down. And they are not restoration people. They did not believe they were going to move it and rebuild it somewhere. They just got rid of the logs and put them out in the yard. And friends of mine went and got pieces of the log that they used for carving because they knew they had such a spirit, those logs. The place was suffused with a magical energy. There's what it looks like up close. A real log building. This is the door of the men. On the other side is a door in the same position, but at the other end, the door of the women. The men sit at one side, the women sit at another. They don't sit together. They're two different spirits. Although there were times when I sat with the women just by default, and I had no problem with it. But a lot of the guys are very macho and insecure, and the women are women and the men are men. But you see, this is the interior of it. It's like a Quaker meeting house, except that there is a stove at either end. And that's where the ashes are burned from the fires. People come for the ceremonies. They bring wood and logs from their own home fire and put it all together, and they do a ceremony called stirring ashes. And everyone goes up and takes a turn at stirring the ashes up, so the ashes of all of us become one ash. It is such a moving ceremony. Then we have the stomp dance. We go in an oval between the two stoves, around and around and around. We go in the clockwise, the clockwise direction. The Anishinaabe go in the counterclockwise. And I was told both directions are fine. One winds the world up, one unwinds it, and it's okay. If we have visitors, Anishinaabe visitors, we'll dance in their direction. It's sacred, but not that sacred. So, put it together. Beautiful accommodation. Native culture is very gentle. Never condemns people. And always makes things okay. It never puts you in a position where you're doing things wrong. Never. Too much compassion. I used to feel like a bit of a fool in some of the ceremonies because I didn't grow up with them, and they were so new to me, and I couldn't participate fully. I couldn't participate unless I really understood what I was doing. And they were fine. You know, I'd sit it out at the side, and then they would say, okay, at this point, Bill, you have to come in and do a stomp dance with us. You must go around the longhouse just 3 times. Then you're okay. You've done your duty. So they pull me up. I go around stomping, then sit down. Good. So, you know, I'm saying, don't they see me as an alien? No, not at all. You're one of us. You're one of us. And it's a beautiful feeling to be called one of us. It would be like being on the faculty here, and at your faculty meeting, one of your colleagues says, you're one of us. It's a good feeling. We want to be a part of something. Well, Native people make sure everyone is a part of something. And here's a beautiful story about this dance up and down the longhouse. If there is someone who comes and let's say they have a disability, and we have those, they can't walk, for instance. They're crippled by something. Maybe they lost an arm. Maybe, they had tuberculosis, or maybe they have cancer. What do? Because they can't dance around with us, we put them right in the middle of the room. There's a bench. I think you can see it. And we sit them on that bench and dance around them. So they are intimately with us, even though they can't move like we move. That's the compassion of the Longhouse. It is stunning. And what a stunning lesson it would be for us. If we're in a group and there are people there with disabilities, put them in the middle and let's dance around them. That's the healing thing to do. That's what they need. These people who have disabilities need love. That's what it is. We don't have the word love, but it is love. You can feel it. Okay, moving on to another story. This is our chief, William Johnson. He was a Mohawk chief. Here we see a sketch of him in his clothes where he combines European and native clothes. He was our keeper of the forest. This is a beautiful love story now. Johnson was visiting the Methodist minister up the road from Six Nations. Their name was Elliot. And Mr. Elliot's sister-in-law was visiting, and his wife's sister. George fell ill while he was at the house, and he was bedridden, and the sister-in-law took care of George, and she fell in love with him right there. But she was British. Emily Howells was her name. Very British. She was visiting Canada on a bit of a lark, really. It was a great adventure. being near a native community. This is in the 1880s. So they fell in love. Now they wanted to get married, but no one would marry a native man and an English woman. They refused. Every minister, every Catholic church, they went all over Upper Canada trying to find somebody. Finally, they did find somebody. They had to go to Montreal, and then they came home married. But that's the kind of situation people faced in those days. They fell in love, like my own parents fell in love, but they couldn't marry. Oh, this union of Johnson with his wife was one of the most beautiful stories you could ever imagine. In those days, there weren't architects. However, George Johnson, he did drawings for a house for his wife. He said, you know, I can't go back to England because I'm a chief of our nation. I have to be here, which means you have to live here on our territory. And of course, she was quite intimidated because she was a very proper British woman from all accounts. But he said, I will design you a British-style house. And this is the drawing he produced and showed her. It is the party of the Georgian house, center hall with 4 rooms. This is the party and the architecture that all 6 nations absolutely love because it reminds them of the Longhouse. It is the Longhouse, but it's not the Longhouse. And they built this house. This is the forest around the house. Beautiful. He was the keeper of the forest. He was the one who went around and kept settlers from coming onto our territory and harvesting our wood, which they did all the time. We had to chase them out, if you can believe it. And he paid a price for it, by the way. And then here is the site plan of the house. Chief's Wood, they called it. And here's the spectacular thing about it. The front elevation with the center doors is exactly like the rear elevation. Two-row. This is a 2-row house. And here it is today, with beautiful French windows that go down to the floor on the main level, so that when they were opened, the breeze came through the house. It was you feel very much like you're outdoors, but you're in a house. Here's the opposite side. This faces the road. A 300-foot deep lawn, or 150-meter deep lawn from the road. Of course, all people had was walking, a horse, and a buggy. And that road was well traveled. And then from the riverside, this is what the house looked like. The exact same elevation. Front to back, side to side. As symmetrical as can be. And it's built of logs that have been plastered over. Here are the French doors, which I find so elegantly Parisian even, if I could say so. And then the interior was all decorated out with wallpaper from William Morris in England, the most famous designer of the arts and crafts. And their wallpapers, because he wanted her to have something familiar, they bought the wallpaper from England to do a house on an Indian territory. Stunning. Chief's Wood. We had a lot of visitors at 6 Nations who loved visiting the Johnsons because the house was utterly charming, like their own houses back home. And here it was out in the middle of the woods. They found it delightful. They had many famous visitors. The Johnsons Mrs. Johnson, being British, she knew how to serve British tea and British manners, and they had 2 daughters and a son, and 2 sons. Sorry. Their one daughter became very famous. Her name? Emily Pauline Johnson. Absolutely beautiful woman who was a poet. And she's a very famous today Canadian poet, but she was well known for unifying the country of Canada in the late 1800s by doing poetry readings from New Brunswick to British Columbia. She would go by train, and the train was very new, and she would get off at stops, and she would do her poetry reading. And in those days, people liked the poetry reading for entertainment, but she sort of turned it up a notch by coming out to recite her poems first in a beautiful British evening gown, and then she would go at the intermission, go back and put on her buckskins and come out as a native woman. 2 worlds. She did the 2 worlds. She was Mohawk and British, just like myself. And she's a great heroine. I mean, she lived a somewhat tragic life. She died in Vancouver, and she is the only person ever buried in Stanley Park. Her friends were very well connected. She lived there at the end of her life. She died of breast cancer. Those women arranged for her to have a burial in Stanley Park. It's very touching. 6 nations to Stanley Park. Put it together. Talk about an important story. Untold. You're hearing it in this class. And I'm only sharing it with you to wake you up. To wake you up to what you're living with here. And to borrow this beautiful history in your work. And you can, because I do it. And I'm going to show you in the final lecture how you do it. I know other architects have done it. Now here is one of her most famous poems, because she used to canoe on the Grand River. And she wrote this poem, Song My Paddle Sings. Deionwage, that's her name. She is 2 rivers flowing side by side. That is the Turo Wampum, and that is her name, her native name. If I can say so, my mother used to recite these poems to us as children, because my mother loved her. But she said, the river rolls in its rocky bed. My paddle is plying its way ahead. Dip, dip, will the waters flip. In foam as over their breast we slip. She's a Victorian. People love that poem. Simple as it is. And it's not, it's sophisticated and not sophisticated. The river rolls in its rocky bed. My paddle is plying its way ahead. When you paddle, it's up here. Dip, because that's what happens. Well, the waters flip. They go up in foam as over their breast we slip. Just to say the word breast was considered shocking. But she did it. Now, here's another great moment in our history in Brantford and 6 Nations. In the middle of a square in downtown Brantford, it's called Victoria Square, there are sidewalks replicating the British ensign. Okay, it's a, if I could say so, based on the École des Beaux-Arts, the great symmetrical park. In the middle of the park is this monument, and the story of this monument is spectacular. On top is Joseph Brant, and below him are warriors from the 6 Nations rendered. You can see in this photograph, the bottom right are two of the warriors, and they're obviously in the Bear Society because there's a great bear there. The other side of the monument on the upper right are the other warriors from the other nations, and they're all looking out in the four directions. And Brant is on top looking out for us. Now, this piece of sculpture was commissioned in an international competition. The sculptor was Percy Wood from London, England. He wasn't native. However, this competition really caught his imagination, and he did some research and presented a maquette, and they chose him. Then he came to Six Nations to do his research, and he looked at the faces of the people to model his sculpture after. He learned Mohawk. They gave him a headdress and made him an honorary chief. And he's just, if you see the picture of him, he's just a very kind of unassuming British man, young man caught up in the romance of Six Nations, created this monument. Now, when the monument was revealed, Pauline Johnson was still alive. They asked her to write a poem. The attendance at the unveiling was huge. The whole town, native and non-native, gathered around this monument because the non-native people loved it too. They understood this is their heritage, and here it is consolidated. Now, this is a little aside about what's embedded in this. They drilled a hole right through the bottom granite. There are two openings, and they made them the size of canning jars. And so the native side had canning jar here and the white side here, and they were asked to put artifacts in them and a time capsule. Then they took the two jars and pushed them through until they touched in the middle under the monument. Then they sealed them up. They're still there. That's how much they loved each other. Now you look at that incident and compare it to the terrible turmoil we're in, native and non-native, and it's crazy how low we have gone from this high moment. This is just graceful, really. And people have a short memory. And there's probably a reason, because the residential school wasn't built until 1904. And it was there that they were drumming this kind of feeling out of the young people, so they had no memory. And therefore, they were the parents of a next generation who had no memory. They had ruined the memory of the people in the name of colonization. Oh, that is Pauline Johnson's grave in Stanley Park in a vintage photograph. There's a small fountain, and they buried ashes here. She was cremated. Okay. I want to just show you this map because there's Cambridge at the top of the map. There is Six Nations of the Grand River at the bottom. There is the Grand River. And that's the intimate relationship we have to this location and to Six Nations. This is why my course is kind of fundamental to studying here. This is the story we should all know, and you're very fortunate that it's being told by another architect, because that is extremely rare. I have a very good friend at Six Nations, Brian Porter, who is a successful architect on a native territory, but he doesn't know these stories. He did not study with elders. He knows them by hearsay because people are repeating them all the time, but he never got a rigorous teaching. But he still tries hard. We're going to look at some of his buildings at the end. There is what it looks like today. In the middle is the little town of Olshewigin. We don't know what the name means. And it's all divided up in squares with roads in one direction going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 line, and in the other directions all named after the Six Nations. Mohawk, Onondaga, da. And the grid for our reserve is shifted off the grid for Southern Ontario by about 15 degrees. So that when you come near the reserve, the roads all of a sudden kink. And it becomes kind of confusing for people because, oh, you think you're on a road and you're going east-west, and then all of a sudden you're not east-west anymore. And, people get confused. It's kind of a confusing place, and that's one of the reasons we don't get a lot of visitors, because as soon as they drive onto the reserve, first of all, they don't see a lot of signage, which they're used to. So you don't know what's what. People have businesses, but they're in their houses, and they're all known by hearsay, not by signage. And then you have this grid pattern of roads that all look like country roads, but you'll notice there are houses along them, and they're just sitting there in the woods. And we don't have a zoning ordinance, so you can build as close or far from the road as you want. We're not used to that. Okay, the last one is the white pine with the 5 needles bound together. And in spite of all of our history, and we'll look at the residential schools in the next lecture, in spite of all of our history, we had a great foundation right until 1904 when they built the residential school. And there are a couple of other events in the 20th century that racked us to the core. You haven't seen it yet, but you're going to see a history which is shocking. And it took place right here. Then the last lecture, we're going to move out of that desperate, sad history into a beautiful future. How do we do Indigenous architecture with integrity? I wish I had a whole course to teach that, but I'm trying to teach you a smattering of the core of what I am trying to reveal to you, and hope that you'll take it up. So thank you very much. Ona.